she was 19 and homeless. Not for a bad month, homeless with nothing behind her at all, no family living, no house she could name, and not one single picture of a face she had lost. And with $10, the last money she owned, she bought a sealed boxcar standing on a rusted siding outside a rail junction in the Nebraska plains, a car the railroad had chained shut and left where it stood 30 years before. The doors were wired and padlocked and stamped with a company seal. The lock had rusted into one solid lump of iron. The freight agent at the junction told her that Carr had been sitting under lien since before he was born, that nobody had ever opened it, and that a girl who spent her last $10 on a locked box was a fool who'd be hungry by Sunday. But what nobody knew, not the agent, not the junction, not the girl herself, was that behind those sealed doors, untouched since 1861, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ivy Tarrant could not remember her mother's face, and it was the great hollow at the center of her life. She was born in 1872 in a Nebraska rail town, and her mother had died when Ivy was 4. A fever, quick, the way it went in those years. And by the time Ivy was old enough to understand what she had lost, the memory had already gone. She could remember a voice, or thought she could. She could remember the feeling of being carried. But the face was gone. Worn away the way a name wears off a wooden marker, and there was no photograph, because photographs cost money and her family had never had any. Her father remarried and moved on, and did not speak of the first wife, and there was no one else to ask, and so Ivy Tarrant grew up with a mother-shaped blank where other people had a face. She used to make them up. That was the shameful private thing she never told anyone. Lying in the dark as a child, she would build a face out of pieces, a woman she'd seen at a church supper, a jaw from her own reflection, eyes she simply invented, and try to hold it steady, and every time she knew she was lying to herself, and every time she did it again anyway, because an invented face was better than nothing. And when she got older, she came to understand the thing that would shape her whole life, that a person who has no image of the dead loses them twice, once when they die, and again, slowly, as the face goes. And that the second loss is quieter and in some ways worse, because you cannot even grieve it properly. You can only notice, year by year, that a little more of them is gone. She asked when she was small, and learned not to. Her father would go still in a way that frightened her and say he did not recall, which she understood much later was not forgetting but a door being shut. Her stepmother said once, not unkindly, that dwelling on the dead was a poor use of a living girl. There were no relations on her mother's side that anyone could name. They had come from somewhere east and scattered, the way families did. So there was no one, anywhere, who could have described the woman to her. And Ivy learned that a face is not like a name or a date, which anybody can tell you. A face is held only in the people who saw it, and when they go, or go silent, it goes with them, completely, and there is no book you can look it up in. She noticed other people's photographs after that, everywhere, with a kind of hunger she was ashamed of. The tintype on a neighbor's mantel, the little framed oval a woman at the laundry kept in her apron and took out at dinner. She would look too long and then make herself stop. She never once in 19 years said out loud to another human being that she could not remember her mother's face, because it seemed to her a childish thing to still be carrying, and because she suspected that saying it would make it more true. Her father died when she was 17, and the stepmother had never wanted her, and there was nothing to inherit. The family had lived on the edge of nothing for 20 years. Ivy went out to work, a hotel kitchen, then a laundry, then whatever the rail towns offered, and she was let go at 19 when the laundry cut its help, and found herself sitting on her carpetbag outside a depot with $10 and no place in the world to go, which is a thing that happens to a great many girls and almost never makes the newspapers. She heard about the boxcar in that same depot from 2 railroad men killing time. There was an old car out on the dead siding at Sidell Junction, one of them said, been there since before the war, chained and sealed and under an unpaid lien, and the company had finally given up and put it on the abandoned property list. $10 would buy it, car and contents, sight unseen, at the lien sale. But nobody ever bought those, he said, because nobody knew what was in them. And 9 times out of 10 it was rotted freight and rat bones, and the 10th time it was nothing at all. Who'd pay $10 for a locked box? And the 2 of them laughed. But Ivy Tarrant did not laugh. She sat very still on her carpetbag and turned it over, and the thing that caught in her was not the hope of treasure. It was the sealed part. 30 years, and nobody had looked. Whatever was in that car was exactly as somebody had left it, in a world that had otherwise moved on and forgotten and lost everything else. She had spent her whole life losing things that could not be gotten back. A face, a voice, a mother, and here was a box that had lost nothing at all, that had kept everything, that had held one moment of 1861 perfectly still while every other thing in the world wore away. She had $10. She wanted, more than she could explain, to know what a sealed thing looked like when it was finally opened. She walked out to Sidell Junction, and then 2 miles past it, down the dead siding where the rails ran into weeds and stopped, and she found it standing alone in the tall grass. A boxcar, wooden-sided, its red paint gone to the color of old brick and blistering off in sheets, its trucks sunk to the axles in 30 years of sod and thistle, vines up one end, the roof walk rotted away. And on the door, the thing that made her heart go, the great sliding door pulled shut, the hasp wired, and hanging from it a padlock swollen orange with rust, and beside it a lead seal on a wire, stamped with the railroad's name and a date, unbroken. Nobody had opened it. 30 years of weather and thieves and curious boys, and the seal was still whole. To the railroad men it was rotted freight and rat bones. To Ivy Tarrant, standing in the tall grass with her carpetbag, it was the only thing she had ever seen that had kept everything it was given. The lien sale was handled at the junction by the freight agent, a brisk, irritable man named Ellis Crouch who could not think why the girl wanted it. The car was worthless, he told her. It had been sidetracked in the war years over an unpaid freight bill, and the consignee had never come, and the charges had piled up past the value of anything inside. The company had held it under lien for 30 years out of pure bureaucratic inertia and had finally written it off. There was nothing in it, Crouch said, but whatever had rotted in there since Lincoln was alive. $10 took the car and its contents as they stood, no warranty, no refunds. And his advice, freely given, was that a young woman with $10 ought to buy a week's board and a decent pair of shoes, and not a rotted box on a dead siding. Ivy laid her $10 on the counter and signed the bill of sale in a plain, careful hand, and Ellis Crouch shook his head and stamped it and told her the lock was hers to break and good luck to her. She could not break it that first day. The padlock had rusted into one lump, and the hasp was wired, and the door had swollen into its track, and she was a girl of 19 with no tools at all. She walked back to the junction and traded 2 days of work in the section house kitchen for the loan of a crowbar and a hammer, and she came back and worked at it for the better part of an afternoon in the hot grass, and it was in the middle of that afternoon that the one person who mattered came down the siding to see what the noise was. Her name was Mahala Reddick, and she was somewhere past 70, and she had lived in a section house at Sidell Junction for 50 years, and knew every foot of that yard and every story in it. She stood in the grass and watched the girl fight the door, and she said, mildly, that she'd wondered her whole life what was in that car. And then she said the thing that stopped Ivy's hammer in the air. She said that she remembered when it was sealed. She had been a girl of about 20 herself, Mahala said, in the spring of 1861. And the car had been sidetracked because the man who had shipped it never came for it. A traveling photographer, she said, who had come through the junction that spring going west, and had gone on ahead by coach to make arrangements, and had died out there somewhere. Of what nobody ever learned. And his car had sat, and the charges had run, and by the time the company understood that no one was coming, the war had started and nobody had time for a sidetracked freight car. And after that, it was just there, the way things are just there, until it had been there so long that it stopped being a thing anyone thought about at all. A photographer, Ivy said. That's what they said Mahala Reddick. Had a whole traveling gallery in that car, went from town to town making pictures. Ivy Tarrant turned back to the door and hit the lock like she meant to kill it. It gave at last, near sundown, the corroded shackle snapping and the wired hasp coming free, and then the two of them together, the girl of 19 and the woman past 70, put their shoulders to the great door and rocked it in its rusted track until it groaned and slid, and the air of 30 years came out at them, dry and dusty and faintly chemical, and the low red sun went in through the open door and lit up the inside of Ansel Pike's traveling gallery exactly as he had left it in the spring of 1861. It was a photographer's studio on wheels. That was the first thing, and it was so unexpected and so complete that Ivy simply stood in the doorway and looked. Down one side ran a workbench with bottles in fitted racks, most of them still stoppered, their labels gone brown. There was a great camera on a tripod, its brass lens capped, standing patient in the dust as if the operator had just stepped out. There was a folded, painted backdrop, a balustrade, and a garden, the kind of thing that made a homesteader look like landed gentry for one glorious sitting. There were props, a chair, a false column, a child's rocking horse. At the far end, curtained off, was a small dark room, its work counter still laid out with trays, and along both walls, floor to roof, in rack after rack after rack, stood wooden boxes, and the boxes were full of glass. Ivy lifted one plate out and held it up against the red evening light coming through the door. The glass was heavy and cold and slick with 30 years of dust, and at first she could make nothing of it. A gray smear, a negative, dark where it ought to be light. She wiped it on her sleeve and turned it, and found the angle where the low sun came through it, and the image assembled itself out of nothing the way a face assembles out of fog. It was a woman's face, a young woman in a plain dress, seated very straight in the chair Ivy had just walked past, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the camera with that particular unblinking gravity that everyone had in those long exposures. 30 years in the dark, and she was perfect, the light on her cheek, the exact set of her mouth, a loose bit of hair by her ear that she had not managed to tuck in. Ivy Tarrant stood in the door of a boxcar on a dead siding, holding a stranger's face in her hands, and began, without any warning to herself, to cry. Because she knew what she was holding. She knew it instantly and completely, the way you know a thing you have wanted your whole life. Somewhere out there, right now, there was a family who could not remember what this woman looked like. There were grandchildren who had a name and a story and no face. And here she was, kept whole in a wooden box in the dark for 30 years, waiting. She put the plate back in its slot very carefully, the way you'd lay down something living, and then she looked down the length of the car at the racks going away into the dark, box after box after box, and did the arithmetic, and had to sit down on the doorsill because the number was not a number she could hold. There were thousands of them, thousands of faces, in the dark, 2 miles from a junction where a man had told her that afternoon there was nothing in there but rat bones. They found the letter that night, by lantern, on the workbench, held down by a brass lens cap. The paper had gone amber and the hand was quick and slanting and warm, and it had been written to no one in particular, which is to say to whoever came. To the finder of this car it began, "If you are reading this, then I have not come back for it, and that is a hard thing to write, and I will not dwell on it. My name is Ansel Pike, and I am a photographer, and for 11 years I have gone up and down this country in this car, making pictures of people who would otherwise have none. I want to tell you what is in here," he wrote, "because you may not understand it at first, and it would be very easy for you to sell the glass for the silver in it, which is what usually becomes of a dead photographer's work, and I am asking you not to." He had begun, he wrote as an ordinary itinerant, pull into a town, set up, make portraits for those who could pay, move on. But he had come over 11 years to see the thing his trade actually was. He photographed homesteaders and freighters and railroad men and their wives and their children, people who worked with their hands 18 hours a day and had nothing, and who would scrape together $1 they could not spare to sit for one picture. And he came to understand why. It was not vanity. It was terror. They were afraid of exactly what Ivy Tarrant had lived, that they would die out here in this enormous country and be forgotten so completely that not even their own grandchildren would know what their faces had been. "A picture is the only thing most people ever get," he wrote, "that says, 'I was here, and this is what I looked like, and I mattered enough that somebody stood me in front of a lens.'" And so he had done a thing that made no business sense at all. He had kept a negative of every single sitting. Not the print went to the family, that was the sale. But the glass plate he kept, filed and boxed and labeled, town by town and year by year, 11 years of it. Because a print gets burned in a house fire, he wrote, or lost in a move, or handed down until nobody knows who it is, and then it is thrown out. But the plate can make another print. As long as the plate exists, the face is not lost. "I have 4,160 plates in this car," he wrote, "and I know what most people would say that is worth, which is the price of the glass. But I have come to think of them as something else, and I want to say it plainly even if it sounds foolish. I think this car is a bank. Every family that sat for me made a deposit, and the deposit was their face, and someday, in 20 years, in 50, somebody in that family is going to want it back, and will not know it exists. The register," he wrote, "was in the drawer beneath the bench, every plate numbered, with the name, the town, and the date. 11 years of the frontier's faces, indexed. I am going west ahead of the car to arrange the next season," he wrote, "and I am leaving this note because I am 49, and the roads are hard, and a man ought to be sensible. If I do not come back, I ask whoever opens this door to do one thing before anything else: read a few of the names in that register, and then look at a few of the faces, and then decide whether you can really sell 4,000 people for the silver. If you can, I will not haunt you. Times are hard, and glass is glass. But if you cannot, if it strikes you the way it strikes me, then here is what I would ask. Find them. The register has the towns. Print the plates and take the pictures back to the families they belong to. Charge what they can pay, or nothing at all. There is money in the tin under the bench, my whole season's earnings, and it is yours, and I would like it spent on paper and chemicals and railroad fare more than on anything else in the world. Some of those people are dead by now," he wrote, "and more will be dead by the time you read this. That is exactly the point. A. Pike, in the car at Siddell Junction, April 1861. Ivy Tarrant read that letter 3 times by lantern light, and old Mahala Reddick sat on the photographer's posing chair and listened, and when Ivy finished the 3rd reading, neither of them said anything for a while. Then Mahala said, "My mother sat for a man in a railroad car when I was a girl. She said it was the only picture ever made of her, and it burned with the house in 74. They found her in 40 minutes. Plate 2213, the register said. Reddick, Sarah, Siddell Junction, August 1859. Ivy held the plate up to the lantern, and a woman past 70 leaned in and looked at her own mother's face for the first time in 35 years, and made a sound that Ivy Tarrant never forgot for the rest of her life. That was the moment the whole thing was decided, and neither of them ever pretended otherwise. There was money in the tin under the bench, exactly as the letter said. A full season's earnings for an itinerant photographer, saved in coin more money than Ivy had ever held. It was not a fortune. It was, precisely, enough to buy paper and chemicals, to make the darkroom work again, to pay her way up and down a rail line for years, which is what he had meant it for, and which is what she did with it. She learned the trade from the car itself. That first winter, with Mahala Reddick's section house for shelter and the boxcar for a workshop, Ivy Tarrant taught herself to print, from Ansel Pike's own notes pinned above the bench, from the labeled bottles, from ruining 100 sheets of paper until she stopped ruining them. It was exacting, poisonous, freezing work in an unheated car in a Nebraska winter, and she was 19 and had never done anything like it, and she did not stop. By spring she could take a plate that had lain in the dark for 30 years and bring a face up out of it in a tray, which is a thing that never once stopped feeling to her like raising the dead. It nearly beat her, more than once. She could not read half of Pike's notes at first, because they were written in a working man's shorthand for a process he already knew and did not need explained to himself. She had no idea what most of the bottles were, and there was no one within 100 miles to ask. She ruined plates, that was the part that made her sick, the irreplaceable ones, 4 faces gone forever in her first fortnight, because she did not yet know what she was doing, and she wrote those 4 numbers on the wall above the bench and left them there for 40 years as a discipline. She got the chemicals on her hands until they cracked. She worked with the car door open a hand's width for light and froze, and closed it and could not see, and rigged a lamp and a red cloth and burned 3 more plates before she got it right. Old Mahala brought her hot bricks for her feet and did not once suggest she stop, which Ivy said afterward was the single greatest kindness anybody ever did her, because everybody else she met that winter suggested she stop. And then one gray afternoon in February a face came up in the tray, a bearded man, some homesteader, plate 1704, and it was clean and sharp and right. And Ivy Tarrant stood over a developing tray in a frozen boxcar and understood that she had just learned how to do it. And then she began to give them back. It took her the rest of her life. That is not a figure of speech. The register listed 4,160 sittings across 11 years and 140 towns, and Ivy Tarrant spent 41 years finding those families. She would take a town, a whole box of plates, 140 faces, all from one place, and she would print them, and then she would go there. She would put a notice in the local paper and set up in a church hall or a hotel dining room with the prints laid out on a long table, and she would say, "These are photographs made in this town in 1856. Come and see whether your people are here." She never charged more than $1, and mostly she charged nothing. She got good at the running of it, the way you get good at anything you do 400 times. She learned to write the newspaper notice so it did not sound like a swindle, which was harder than it sounds, because a stranger arriving in town offering pictures of your dead relations is exactly what a swindle sounds like. She learned to lay the prints out by year rather than alphabetically, because people did not come knowing a name, they came knowing roughly when. She learned to keep a chair near the table, because people's legs went. And she learned to stand back and say nothing at all while somebody looked, because there was no help she could give in that moment, and any word from her was an intrusion on something private. What happened in those rooms was the work of her life. A man of 60 finding his father, dead 40 years, and having to sit down. 3 grown sisters standing over the only image of the mother they had lost as small children, all of them crying and none of them able to say a word. A woman who took her print home and came back an hour later to say she had put it up on the wall, and the room felt different now. And over, the thing Ivy understood better than anyone alive, because it was the hollow at the center of her own life, people who had a name and a story and no face, and who now had a face, and who did not have the words for what that was worth, and did not need them. Because Ivy already knew. She met the ones who couldn't be found, to whole towns gone. Families scattered past tracing, names in the register she chased for years and never placed. She kept those plates all the same, and printed them all the same, and hung the unclaimed prints along the walls of the car, hundreds of them eventually, a gallery of the unidentified frontier, because Ansel Pike had been right that a plate keeps a face, and Ivy Tarrant would not be the one who let go of a face just because she couldn't find who it belonged to. Somebody, she used to say, is looking for every single person on this wall. They just don't know yet that there's anything to look for. Ellis Crouch, the freight agent who had told her she'd be hungry by Sunday, lived to see the rotted box on the dead siding become a thing people came from 3 states to visit, and had the grace, some years on, to bring her a plate number himself. His wife's grandmother, Wahoo, 1858, and to stand in the doorway of that car with the print in his hands and admit he had never in his life been so wrong about $10. He came back every year after that, on the same week, and never said why, and Ivy never asked. And she found her mother. It took 11 years. She had looked, of course. She had gone through the register for Tarrant the first week and found nothing, and had made herself accept it, because her family had never had money and a photograph was money. But in the 9th box of the 9th year she was working through the plates from a little town called Pell's Crossing, printing them one after another the way she did, and a face came up in the tray that stopped her hands. She had never seen it before, and she knew it at once. The register said, Bowen, Harriet, Pell's Crossing, 1857, her mother's name before she married. 16 years old in the picture, in a dress that had plainly been borrowed, sitting very straight with her hands folded, looking at the lens with an expression Ivy had been trying and failing to invent in the dark since she was a child. Ivy Tarrant sat down on the floor of a boxcar with a wet print in her hands and cried for a long time, and then she washed it and dried it properly, because she was a professional, and then she looked at her mother's face for about 4 hours. She said afterward, she told this to a great many people over the years, in church halls, standing at her long table, that it was not what she expected. She had expected relief, or grief, or the end of something. What she got instead was recognition, not of the woman, of herself. She had her mother's jaw. She had been carrying it around for 28 years and had never known. She had that print with her for the rest of her life. And she told the story in every hall she ever worked, before she opened the table. Because it was the whole argument in one piece, I had no picture of my mother, and I got her back after 28 years, and so might you. Come and look. If you go to Siddell Junction today, and there is still a junction there, small, where the branch meets the main line, the car is still on the siding, on new trucks and under a roof they built over it in the 20s to keep the weather off. It is a museum now, and a working darkroom still, and the whole of Ansel Pike's gallery is inside it, the great camera, the painted backdrop, the racks, and behind glass the register in his quick slanting hand, and the letter that begins to the finder of this car. Along the walls hang the unclaimed 611 faces from 140 towns, still waiting for someone to walk in and recognize a jaw. People do, still, it happens 2 or 3 times a year. And when it happens, they take the print down off the wall and give it to whoever knew the face, and there is a book by the door where they write the name and the date, and the book is nearly full. And by the door, framed, hangs a photograph of a 16-year-old girl in a borrowed dress at Pell's Crossing in 1857, with a small card under it, in a plain, careful hand that says, "This is my mother. It took me 28 years and $10 to find her." Yours may be on this wall. There is a kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with refusing to let a person be forgotten. It waits in the sealed dark of the world's locked boxes, not for the one who wants what the glass is worth, but for the one who understands exactly what a face is worth, because they lost one and never got it back. The world had told Ivy Tarrant she was worthless the same way it had told that boxcar it was rotted freight and rat bones, with a chain and a rusted lock and a price nobody would pay. It only ever takes one person who knows what it is to lose a face to prove the world's cold arithmetic wrong. Ivy Tarrant was 19 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a sealed boxcar on a dead siding outside a junction in the Nebraska plains. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, is there someone in your family you have a name for, but no face? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.